The second perspective is this. I went back and have looked at the decades of my life. Some of you will identify with these, but I'm 67. When I turned 60 in 2002, right after 9/11, right after dot-com collapse, stock market was crashing. And then I went back when I turned 50, 1992. Bill Clinton had just been elected president. We were in an Iraq war. We were in a recession. And most people were predicting we wouldn't survive the 90s. The stock market was at around 3,000 at that point. There was nobody that anticipated what went on in the 90s. We hadn't even heard of Y2K yet in 1992. 1982, when I was 40, was when we had double-digit inflation, if you remember that, 21% prime rate. You remember mortgages. It was when adjustable rate mortgages were introduced because nobody would ever do a fixed rate mortgage again. So and the variable rate mortgages were 14, 15, 16, 17%. I didn't think that we would survive the 80s because of the hyperinflation that was going on. This was before the S&L crisis, if you remember that, in 1987. But 1982 was a very, very scary time financially. Well, 1972, when I turned 30, I was a practicing CPA. It's when we had an oil embargo in 1972. Remember that? Some of you remember standing in line for gasoline because of the oil embargo. And that's when all alternative forms of energy were introduced. We were in inflation. We went off the gold standard. The prime hit 10% for the first time. It was a really, really scary time. Hal Lindsey wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, which was a million seller. It's not getting any better, so I went back to when I was 20, 1962. I was in a fraternity house at Indiana University. I remember watching Nikita Khrushchev bang his shoe on the table at the UN saying, "We will bury you." It was the nuclear crisis with Cuba and Russia in 1962. I was wondering whether I would even have a world to graduate to. In 1952, when I was 10, I was taught how to get under my desk at school because of the coming nuclear holocaust. We were in the midst of the Cold War, Berlin Wall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 1942, when I was born, was right after Pearl Harbor. So what's the point? I'm bad luck. Here's the point. Economic uncertainty is certain. It is never going to change. Now, the economy can change a little bit, but the reality is there's another crisis waiting to happen. And when we get through that one, there will be another crisis waiting to happen. As I've looked back over my life and I've studied a little bit on history, this began in Egypt with Joseph. And Joseph saved for 7 years so that they had the plenty for 7 years. That was the first recorded worldwide economic collapse. And that's really what happened. And Joseph followed biblical principles, and he had enough, and the rest of the world didn't. I've been on a whole bunch of radio programs, and the first question that has been coming up is, well, what happened with the subprime crisis and the Lehman Brothers and Merrill Lynch and so forth and so on? And the instant answer to that is when you violate God's principles, there's a consequence. And we violated God's principles in families, in businesses, in our government, and certainly on Wall Street. I said when I owned a bank, we would loan out 60% of our deposits. Today, which was considered a little bit risky, today they'll loan out 130 or 40% of their deposits. It's the most highly leveraged industry probably in America. The banking. Well, what is that? What's going on? I think the root cause is greed. Whenever Wall Street figures out how to securitize greed, we have a collapse. Because you can't lose if it comes from Wall Street. Point being, you can only do what only you can do. I was asked what is the key economic indicator that I look at? Dow Jones, Standard & Poor's, what is it? My checkbook. It's the only thing I have control over, is my checkbook. I can control my own finances, but what's going on with healthcare reform, stimulus packages, trade balance deficits, et cetera, I have no control over. And I would encourage you to think of them as noise. Nice, but not necessary. In fact, if you want some real economic security, turn off the TV. Certainly turn off the news, because there's nothing but bad news on the news. Turn it off. It's noise. It's not going to affect your economic well-being, what they're saying on television. The only thing that will affect your economic well-being is what you do with the resources that God has entrusted you with.